Hello, and welcome to the second installment of my land acknowledgement series for mental health professionals. So, I wanted to start out by saying that I did this workshop series because I had a few other colleagues ask me for support with their land acknowledgements, and I thought it might be helpful to compile the resources and share them with others if anyone else was looking for support. So I want to acknowledge the limitations of this just being some of the research that I've found, and also the limitation of me as a white settler being the one facilitating this. Ideally, we would be doing this work in collaboration with an indigenous community or professional or organization to really help us to do this properly and thoroughly. However, I also don't believe that this is the responsibility of Indigenous people to do this work. I think that it is really our responsibility to step up and learn our history and learn more about what's happening now with Indigenous communities, how we are impacting them, and how we can shift from causing harm to supporting them. So I hope this information is helpful. But I just wanted to note that there are some limitations. And just to say in general, when I'm thinking about my land acknowledgement, I think about it as sort of in flux, that as I learn new information, as I grow, as I develop, so will my land acknowledgement, and so will the work that I'm doing in this area. So I would encourage you to also hold that for yourself. So, my first installment of this I did around Indigenous Peoples Day to bring more awareness to that day. And this one I wanted to bring awareness to National Day of Mourning, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. So, National Day of Mourning is associated with the Wampanoag tribe and the United American Indians of New England organization and began in 1970. It is to dispel myths about Thanksgiving in the United States, and also to raise awareness about the historical and ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples. So many Native people don't celebrate the arrival of Pilgrims and other European settlers, and Thanksgiving is a reminder of the genocide of millions of Native people and the theft of Native lands and erasure of Native cultures. Participants on this day honor Indigenous ancestors and Native resilience. It's a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest against the racism and oppression that Indigenous people continue to experience worldwide. So, and all of this is from their website listed here under the event details. And this is also a quote from their website. We are mourning our ancestors and the genocide of our peoples and the theft of our lands. National Day of Mourning is a day when we mourn, but we also feel our strength in action and solidarity. So here are some details about the upcoming event and how you can join and contribute. This is a quote from the founder. We forfeited our country. Our lands have fallen into the hands of the aggressor. We have allowed the white man to keep us on our knees. What has happened cannot be changed, but today we must work towards a more humane America, a more Indian America, where men and nature once again are important, where the Indian values of honor, truth, and brotherhood prevail. You, the white man, are celebrating an anniversary. We, the Wampanoags, will help you celebrate in the concept of a beginning. It was the beginning of a new life for the Pilgrims. Now, 350 years later, it is a beginning of a new determination for the original American, the American Indian. So, just to note that he was asked to speak at an event, and in his speech, he wrote more of an accurate depiction of what's happened with his community. And he was told that he would have to change that in order to be allowed to speak. And that prompted the starting of the first National Day of Mourning in 1970. So this information is from the Rethinking Thanksgiving toolkit listed in the references. So many scholars tend to agree that although there was a feast in 1621, this did not begin the tradition of Thanksgiving. The first recorded Thanksgiving was a celebration of murder. Dutch and English mercenaries massacred over 700 indigenous people during their green corn dance in 1637. The next day, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared Thanksgiving Day to commemorate subduing the Pequots. So just to note, I mean that's just a few lines, but even in that is a real challenge. I don't know about for you, but for me in the history that I learned, that was just this beautiful coming together of different communities and thanks and celebration. And I'm sure there is much more detail, of course, to what happened to the indigenous peoples in this region and how they were impacted by settlers and colonists. So, very different story than I think most of us get. These are some, I think, helpful questions coming from the toolkit. Like, where, for example, did you learn the history of Thanksgiving? Who taught you? Maybe what were some of the messages you got in that story? How does it feel to realize that many of the things you learned about Thanksgiving are myths? So I think as mental health professionals, this is a big area that we can sort of hold the complexity of this situation. So these myths are really what goes into building our narrative, our stories about our identities as Americans. Like, what does it mean to be an American? Um, who is an American? I mean, this is a really big political debate right now. What is un-American? What is American? Who counts as a real American? What are the qualities of an American? What is the history of America? What is its role in the world? What are the qualities of America? In Florida, we also have this interesting example of our history actively being suppressed by the government when there are parts of our history that make the dominant group or white people uncomfortable. And so we can think about this from the psychological lens of how threatening it might feel to the nervous system when it is confronted with a challenge about who we are, information that contradicts or counteracts some of these ideas about who we think we are, and how that can lead to people dismissing information that is presented. They may shut down things like that. So I would encourage you to hold that for yourself as you face some of these things and how you can support your nervous system to face reality and maybe grieve some of these things that you thought were true that aren't. And as you face the harsh realities, we've already started to work on talking about whose ancestral lands we're living on. Another question, what do you know about where your people came from and how they came to the land uh, that they're living on or that you're living on? I think this is a huge question, and there's so much that we can learn about ourselves and what our families have been through. What's learning more about what's playing out in our nervous system, what's playing out in our family system, what's playing out in our communities, is what was this actual process like for these people? Again, we have a national myth about the immigrant story and what immigrants are acceptable. And again, that's a big part of the national debate right now in targeting immigrants. And we may have this myth, and we may even have this myth about our own family. Learning more about the actual people and what their experiences were, what was impacting them. Of course, much of this information may be sort of hidden or lost, but what can we find in terms of what was impacting our family as they um, moved through the world? And then we're also invited into looking at this other layer of how were the indigenous people impacted? What happened to them? How were they displaced? in the lands where our families may have landed, where they had businesses, where they worked in industries. What was that experience like for the indigenous people in those communities? And did our family have any interactions with indigenous people? There's this really good training that I took by the organization White Awake, and it's called something along the lines of Before We Were White. And so exploring this concept of what were our ancestors like when they came to these lands, and what was that process of becoming white Americans or Americans? What did they give up? What did they choose to give up, or were they forced to give up to conform to those standards? And there again can be so much there in terms of what may be playing out in our family systems and experiences of intergenerational trauma. What are the dangers of continuing to perpetuate the myths of Thanksgiving? How do these lies damage trust within families and communities? I mean, in some ways, like what sense of community is possible if we are unwilling to acknowledge the truths of what has happened among different communities or towards different communities? What responsibility do we have to Indigenous peoples whose land bases are being degraded so we might have cheap electricity, oil, and water? So, some of the organizations that I have given us options to donate to, they are fighting around the world to protect their communities and their sovereignty against government and corporate interests and wanting to take their lands and engage in resource extraction, violently engage in those things. Um, what responsibility do we have to those communities? I think there's another piece that we as mental health providers can sort of hold is that, some people say, oh, this stuff happened in the past. It's not, I'm not impacting that. I didn't do that. Well, the reality is that we're continuing to benefit from it. We're continuing to run our businesses, engage in our professions and practices, and make money off of lands that were taken through genocidal violent practices. And how does that, I think it's interesting to sort of think about that we are in a helping profession and doing this healing work and to really sit with what sort of healing work is possible on lands that were uh, violently severed from communities that they were in sacred relationship with. And how is that embedded in the way that we do our work, in the way that our professions are run, in the way that our industries are run? How is that embedded in our field, in the development of our field, how we carry out our field? Because like we've talked about, I mean, there's different ways this shows up, and that's a whole nother conversation uh, that I might do a talk on. But um, just that we don't even acknowledge it. We don't even acknowledge that it happened. We that work in trauma work, we don't even acknowledge how much trauma is in the lands that we live and work on or work with. So there can be a lot there for us to dig into. How does the reality of the doctrine of discovery compare to this myth of a U.S. society based on liberty and justice for all? So we talked a little bit about this last time, what the doctrine of discovery is, but just a reminder, it is a religious and political document that basically says, or legal document that basically says the first Christians to land somewhere, the land belongs to them. So it is a religious, moral, legal, political justification for dehumanizing Indigenous people and violently taking whatever we want from them. And as we talked about before, this is embedded in our legal system. It is a referenced document. And a lot of people, again, don't know this reality. And if you think about that, the history of that, if you think about how, if you learn more about how the US is engaging with indigenous communities here and globally, it really does challenge this story about liberty and justice for all. It's like liberty and justice for who? And then you get into this idea of for all, who counts in for all, who is considered human in that concept of for all. What opportunities do you have to engage in conversations about changing mascots and other harmful representations of Indigenous peoples? So, throughout the country, there are groups that are challenging sports teams and schools to change their mascots. So, like we talked about last time, that one of the ways that discrimination plays out with Indigenous people is holding this sort of static image of them being in the past and not being around today and not even fully acknowledging the fullness of the past, but just having this one image of them, and that is very clearly represented in the mascots. And there's one of the podcasts I recommend, All My Relations. It's an excellent podcast to learn more about the different issues the indigenous communities are facing. And it also, in one of their episodes, they speak to an academic who studies this and has shown that, or has found that these images do have a harmful impact on Indigenous youth. So it does have an impact on the people. There is research to support that. And we can, if we want to, this is something that you could be part of, is supporting these groups and organizations to push back against these representations and make changes. So I was in a recent training with Dr. Nicole Prescott, and she was asked if she recommended people doing land acknowledgements, and it was brought up how they are often empty gestures and, kind of what's the point of them? And she said that she did recommend people doing land acknowledgements, but she also said that a land acknowledgement is a call to action. So, again, this is not just a box to be checked. It's not something just to do and pat yourself on the back for. Unfortunately, a lot of institutions have done that, and that has led to I've seen multiple people in different spaces critiquing Indigenous people critiquing land acknowledgements and questioning them. And I think this is sort of what I'm hearing is this is one of the reasons is it's just like, okay, now what are you doing about it? And so that's really important piece of your land acknowledgement is to think about how are you taking action on this information? What are you doing with this information? How are you moving forward with it? And how are you meaningfully contributing to Indigenous communities? Like we talked about in our last session, they said there was a quote that said something along the lines of, every minute that we're, stressing about trying to get just the perfect words for the land acknowledgement is time and energy that we could be putting towards really meaningfully contributing to Indigenous communities. So that's really the priority here. That's really what's important, even if you're not ready to put out your land acknowledgement yet, is finding ways to get involved and do something about what you've learned. So here's a little bit about what I've committed to doing as part of my practice. I engage in continuous study of colonization and integrate that into my work and my case conceptualization. As you might have picked up on, but I also do other presentations on colonization plays out in so many ways in with us internally, with our relationships, with ourselves and our families and communities. And the lands we live with. And so there's so much that we can gain, I think, as professionals from learning more about the impacts of colonization and how that plays out in the mental health issues that our clients are coming in with. I attend talks and trainings and pursue opportunities to connect with Indigenous communities. I also try to learn from Indigenous scholars through reading books and articles and attending trainings as well. I also donate each year as part of my business practice to Indigenous organizations. There is this concept of a land tax that you could explore, which is paying a tax to Indigenous communities for living and working on their lands. Segura Te Land Trust has more information on their website about land taxes, and they even have a calculator. Now, just to say that this was created in particular for their community, so um, how you may choose to do this may be a little bit different, but I think that can be a helpful example. And if you do decide to utilize their resources, I would encourage you to donate to their organization as well. I also visit sacred and historical sites and look for opportunities to volunteer with their preservation. So another thing that I work on is the NAGPRA project with the University of Florida and the Natural History Museum. So NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So basically, as colonization spread around the world, many institutions actively engaged in, for lack of better words, grave robbing. They stole ancestors and sacred items from indigenous communities um, without their consent, and they either directly took uh, ancestors and sacred items or they received them. And so NAGPRA is a federal law that is challenging organizations to return ancestors and return these sacred items. So I learned about this from the work that I've been doing in engaging more with Indigenous communities and learning more about the issues that the community is facing and things that are priorities and importance to the community. And I researched what was going on locally, and I saw that the university was undergoing this project and that there was a lot of work to be done. And so I reached out to see if I could support the project in some way, even though I don't have experience with archaeology and things like that. When I think of what is the most meaningful thing that I could do for me, the idea of helping ancestors return home and supporting that process is the most meaningful thing I could think of doing for me personally. I read an article that quoted one of the Seminole officials who is working on this project, and she said, you know, look, you have our ancestors in bags and boxes. They can't, or plastic bags and boxes. They can't breathe in there. And it just really spoke to me that I wanted to find a way to support this project. I have gotten multiple degrees from the University of Florida. I frequently go to the museum, and I wanted to be part of that process of righting this wrong. So for me, that has opened up a lot of. I've really enjoyed my work on the project, and then I've also finding other opportunities to get involved in other projects like this. And I'm really enjoying my work. It's really exciting to me, the opportunities. And so I wanted to share this, not because this is what you should do, or I expect you to do this or anything like that, but that I wanted to give you an example of finding something that is meaningful to you. something that brings you joy, something that is important to you, that fits with your values. There are so many different Indigenous organizations. There's so many ways that you could get involved. And I think that it's much more likely that that engagement will be sustainable, and more impactful if you find something that you personally feel called to do versus, again, just checking that box. So I just wanted to give you this example to get you kind of thinking about like what for you would be the thing. What type of work do you feel drawn to? And there's likely an organization. And again, if you have trouble finding that, that's also something you can reach out to me. I can help you find examples. Key is finding an organization that is Indigenous run or actively in collaboration with Indigenous communities. And maybe there's ways to donate. Maybe there's ways to volunteer in other ways with those projects. So, some more information about continued education from the Honor Native Land Guide. So, they encourage us to continue to learn more about Indigenous history on the land that we live on or live with. So we've already started that process, a little bit of the history, but there's a lot more out there. And I'd encourage you to keep learning more with books and articles and organizations. There's a syllabus here that was created in solidarity with the efforts at Standing Rock to resist the construction of Dakota Access Pipeline. The link is here for more information on that syllabus. Um, a link for tribal nations and their historical relationship with the U.S. government, and Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, another book to learn more about more nationally what has been going on in the history. Learning more about the history of broken treaties. So, one of the things that I often hear or read online are people saying, oh, this is just the past, get over it, move on. Excuse me. Well, the reality is that the US government signed treaties with the tribes, with many of the tribes, and they have not always honored those treaties. And so one of the things that's happening is tribes have been taking them to court to honor their treaty rights. And some people are getting some tribes are getting financial settlements, some are getting land back because the government has not honored the treaties that it signed. Now, there's another issue though, because something that I've learned is that unfortunately, even if the treaty is there, it was signed, the judicial system does not even always honor the treaty or seemingly fully understand, unfortunately, how these laws work. And it is has been sort of highlighted in the things that I've studied that a lot of this relates to discrimination because there is a fear that, oh, well, Americans are not going to be able to handle their lands being taken away or being run by tribal governments, and we can't put them through that. So, that would set a bad precedent. So, we're not going to do that, even though making those changes would be honoring the treaties. So, it is still a contentious issue, and tribes are still fighting for their rights and their sovereignty. You could read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, similarly, just because there is this declaration does not mean that it's always followed. This is a contentious issue throughout the world as governments and corporate interests are um, taking lands and seizing lands and um, wanting to extract resources is that they're often not honoring this declaration, and Indigenous people are having to literally fight for their lives. I mean, land defenders, particularly in South America, there is a high level of, unfortunately, of murder. Communities are being starved to death as their forests that they live in are being destroyed. And it is a really violent and horrible situation with some of these projects around the world. So it is, again, just because there is some type of law doesn't mean that it's always followed. And if you think about these communities, that they may not always know their rights, they may not have the resources to fight for their rights. And some of this, and it's sort of a consideration to think about, okay, well, the US initially voted against this. Why did they initially vote against it? And that might give you a little inkling into some of the things that the US government is doing throughout the world with these issues. And again, I don't think most Americans really know about that, but that's something you can learn more about and do something about. Um, because there's that piece with the government, there's also the piece with the corporations that we support, that we buy their products. So you can also learn more about the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. So this is another thing I often hear people say, oh, it's so much, they do such a better job in Canada. I mean, I think there's been a lot of events I've been to, maybe others, where they acknowledge the treaty or the tribe of the lands that they're on. Well, unfortunately, the Canadian government is not really doing a great job at honoring treaty rights. This is also a contentious issue in Canada, where the government is supporting corporate interests and are not always honoring treaty rights, are violently engaging with tribal communities. So it's not all great there either. But I think that's something we can learn more about as well, and think about how we may be contributing to some of that in terms of what resources we use, and how our government is engaging with that process, and how we can support those tribal communities. So another thing that's pointed out is that, so some people may think, oh, well, all Native peoples are living on reservations. Well, there's actually 71% that are living in urban areas. So you may think that, oh, there's not really Indigenous people around. Well, maybe there are more than you think, and maybe there's opportunities to connect. So I wanted to note a little bit about the language here, is that different people have different preferences about what language we use to refer to them. Most of my trainings have used the term Indigenous, as it's a more sort of inclusive term globally, and sort of looking at things from a global perspective. But there are people that don't like that term. And there are people that like the term Native, Native American, American Indian, or prefer to be referred to by the tribal nation that they are part of. So it's important to check in and not assume what someone would like to be referred to by. So some other ideas for building relationship and taking action. So again, thinking about, are there any groups or organizations that you could support and get involved with? Local community members, Indigenous or Native community members that you could engage with, and maybe even work on this practice of acknowledgement with, and explore how that might lead to further dialogue and collaboration. So just a couple things with that. It's important not to assume that Indigenous people want to do land acknowledgements or want to be part of that process. Um, and so if you want to ask someone about that, make sure that it's something that they want to do, that it is a consensual process. And also, how are you compensating them for that labor? So this isn't, that's another critique that's happening is that often people are asking Indigenous people or organizations are saying, hey, come do this land acknowledgement, come do this labor, and they're not compensating people for their work or considering what type of emotional labor that would be for someone. This is talking about traumatic histories often. And so it is important that you um, honor that, acknowledge it, and that this is a consensual process that's as the person or group wants to be part of, and how are you going to compensate them for that labor? So look around and ask yourself, are there Native folks present at your events, on your team, on your board? If not, are there ways to intentionally work on building relationships? So there's many things we could do here. One of the things that I mentioned I've done is seeking out learning opportunities or ways to engage with Indigenous professionals in the mental health field, um, supporting their work, learning more about their work, attending their events. That is a way that we can build a community. Some organizations to check out. The Indigenous Environmental Network does a lot of work to with environmental issues. Cultural survival, I wanted to mention. I've attended a few of their talks. They have a great YouTube channel. Many of their talks are recorded and posted, and you hear directly from Indigenous people around the world about the issues that they're facing and how you can support their community. Indian Country Today. It said this is on hiatus. I'm not sure if that's still true. This was from that uh, the Honor Native Land Guide, I believe, and they have really good information about current events going on in Indigenous communities throughout the country, and maybe different ways you can get inspired to get involved. So this was something I saw in my research from the Indigenous Women of the Americas, defenders of Mother Earth Treaty Compact. We call upon our sisters and their allies around the world to gather together on each new moon to pray for the sacred system of life, guidance, and wisdom, and on every solstice and equinox to become educated concerning the harms to life and the environment, pledge to support the rights of Indigenous peoples, inform yourself and join the circles of global resistance demanding a new system that seeks harmony between humans and the rights of Mother Earth. Pledge to nonviolence and become trained in nonviolent direct action. Nonviolently rise up with others in your community and around the world to demand immediate changes in the laws that have created the destruction. Commit nonviolent acts of civil disobedience where destruction is occurring until it is stopped. Continue these acts until business as usual is halted and life on Mother Earth is safe for generations to come. We stand together, signed on this day, September 27th, 2015. So, I wanted to list this for a couple reasons. One is this gives you very kind of clearly direction on this is what would be helpful is to engage in these things, acknowledging that sacred relationship between Indigenous people and their lands and the earth. So, Indigenous people are at the forefront of fighting to protect the earth, fighting to protect their lands and their sovereignty, but also the fight against climate change, as I'll talk a little bit more about. But or I'll reference again in my land acknowledgments, but that's really fighting for all of us because we are all impacted by the destruction of the environment. We are all impacted by pollution. We are all impacted by climate change. And Indigenous people are literally putting their lives on the line, or they're being forced to, or they're being threatened and harmed and killed because of this violent extraction and destruction of the earth. So these are some prime ways that we can think about getting involved and supporting not only their communities, but supporting our own survival. So, some more ideas for building relationships locally. We've mentioned getting involved with the Gainesville Indigenous Peoples Task Force. There's also in the state the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe, finding ways to what's going on with those communities and how we can support them uh, or be in community with them. Visiting local sites, learning more about the history locally, advocating for education in schools in our communities. So, again, this is under threat in our state. Are there ways that we can push back against this and continue to support people learning the truth about what happened here and what is happening here? I already mentioned Indian Country Today as a potential news resource. Here's some podcasts that you could check out. I mentioned All My Relations is a really good one. This Land is a really excellent podcast that talks more about some court cases and the challenges that tribes are facing in terms of protecting their sovereignty. Wampum codes I wanted to mention as that is done by a local professor at the University of Florida. And it's exploring how the podcast, I believe I've listened to some of it and I've learned some about the professor's project is sort of exploring the values that we put into that are embedded in technology and how we can implement actually indigenous values and values of justice versus some of the things that we're seeing play out with the development of technology and AI are quite discriminatory. So I think that is an excellent resource as well to learn more about what a local Indigenous professor is doing. So I'm going to give a few examples of land acknowledgements that I wrote. The first two are two different versions of one that I wrote for an event for climate psychology. So basically the how climate change impacts mental health and the psychology piece of that. So we acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Muskogee, Timucua, Miccosukee, and Seminole peoples. These communities were forced to leave their homelands through genocidal practices and policies. Despite this, they still stand today and continue to fight for their sovereignty and to preserve their relations and lifeways. Indigenous peoples are experiencing the most detrimental impacts of climate change and are at the forefront of the fight against it. We acknowledge that colonization is the predominant cause of climate change and continues to this day. We hope that our work is part of a broader effort to acknowledge the impacts of colonization and disengage in this violent way of relating to ourselves and others. So, second version of that. We acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Muskogee, Timucua, Miccosukee, and Seminole peoples. These communities were forced to leave their homelands through enslavement, violence, and genocidal policies and practices. Despite the efforts of the U.S. government and colonial forces to exterminate these communities, they still stand today and continue to fight for their sovereignty and preserve their relations and lifeways. Indigenous peoples are experiencing the most detrimental impacts of climate change and are at the forefront of the fight against it. We acknowledge that colonization is the predominant cause of climate change and continues to this day. We hope that our work honors these communities and actively contributes in a small way to the truth and reconciliation process by acknowledging both the past and current realities of colonization, and creating opportunities for people to engage in emotional and relational decolonization. Through reclamation of our relationships and excuse me, through reclamation of our relationships with ourselves, our bodies, our own emotional experience, and active landed relationships, we have an opportunity to disengage with the violence that perpetuates colonization. So quite similar, but just, a little bit different wording. And then here's another one from my website. I acknowledge the historical and ongoing colonization taking place on Turtle Island, presently referred to as the United States. I am a settler colonist on lands where indigenous people face significant violence, and some communities were completely killed, forced to join other communities in fleeing south, or forced to relocate to other parts of the country. Excuse me. For lack of better names, I want to acknowledge that I reside and work on the lands of the Timucua, Patano, and Seminole peoples. I hope that my work supports myself and others to honor the indigenous ancestors of the lands. A portion of profits will be donated yearly to indigenous justice organizations who are actively working to fight ongoing colonization and exploitation of their communities and to support the preservation of their vibrant communities, knowledge, lands, and lifeways. Additionally, I cannot express how grateful I am for what I have learned from Indigenous teachers and will continue to support them through purchase of training materials and offered talks and trainings. So, a couple of things that I tried to do here. One is acknowledge the past of what actually happened, and then also to note my commitment to what I hope that I'm doing and how I am tangibly contributing to Indigenous communities. So things that are meaningful to me and important for me to note. Here are some of the references from my talk today. So that's it for this one. Thank you for joining me for this series, and I hope that it was helpful for you in learning more about these topics and considering doing a land acknowledgement. Like I said, if you're still struggling with that, if you would like one-on-one support, feel free to reach out to me. Um, Again, like we talked about, it's more important than getting the perfect wording to find ways to meaningfully engage with Indigenous communities and support Indigenous communities and organizations. So I would encourage you to go forward with that. As I have noted and asked, please go forward with making a donation if you watch through this webinar series and are taking some information from it. That is my ask, is that you go ahead and start that process. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. I've given you some examples of where you can donate, but think about the things that you're interested in, that you value, that's important to you, and find an Indigenous organization that's working with that topic. Most have a donation link available. You can read through their website, get on their newsletter, find out if there's other ways to get involved as you learn more about the issues. If you're looking for some examples or help finding an organization, you can also reach out on that too. So I hope that this will support you and support our community of mental health providers to move more in a positive direction that aligns more with our excuse me, aligns more with our ethics and who we um, who we want to be in this world with our values as individuals and as mental health professionals. Thank you for joining me today.